Cynthia, which quarterback has the best fantasy matchup for you this week?
Well, it's kind of counterintuitive because this is the game that I think is the most interesting. And the reason I think it's counterintuitive is because both of these teams have been circling this one for a really long time. But Lamar Jackson, for me, against the Chiefs, who are allowing the 8th most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. This is going to be a good one because Lamar's ability to earn you those fantasy points using his legs is going to be a key in this matchup. So I think maybe you could even expect, one rushing touchdown.
Well, I'm looking at one of the guys that's going in that Thursday night game coming up, Gardner Minshew. He's been a top 12 quarterback in back-to-back weeks, has a pair of 3 touchdown games. He's not a big arm guy. Accuracy is more of his strength. He's 3rd in completion percentage over expected, which really is just a fancy next-gen stats way of saying he's hitting his targets at a very high rate, regardless of how much pressure he's seeing or what the circumstances are. He's facing a Dolphins defense giving up about 72% completion percentage and the 3rd most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks.
And if you don't want to watch Thursday night, if you want to hold off on Gardner Minshew and you drafted Dak Prescott, stay with him, folks. It's a must start going up against the defense where he's already scoring 30 points a game fantasy-wise. He's throwing up for over 350-plus a game. And that defense in Seattle, it's allowed top 8 fantasy points from the quarterback position in both games this season. Go ahead and go with the quarterback you drafted in Dak Prescott. Let's look over rank at some running backs, starting with the guy that plays with Dak Prescott.
Well, absolutely. I believe that the quarterback and the running back can both have huge games this week against the Seattle Seahawks. Ezekiel Elliott averaging close to 25 fantasy points per game this year. He's touching the ball 27 times a game. And if your guy Dak wouldn't keep stealing these touchdowns from him, he might have a better performance. But this is a good one against the Seahawks, who have allowed the most total yards per game, close to 500. Those Seahawks, not the Seahawks that we remember from the past.
I know after week 1, people sort of freaked out about Austin Eckler. It calmed down somewhat with his week 2 performance, but he's averaging 20 touches per game. You want that sort of opportunity. He's also 6th in the NFL in rushing yards, so maybe we should just pump the brakes a little bit. I know the touchdown numbers aren't what you want, but touchdowns are fickle beasts. He's got a Carolina defense that's allowed a running back to score multiple rushing touchdowns in each of the first 2 games. Start Austin Eckler. By the way, also start Joshua Kelly while you're at it. Both these guys can have big weeks.
Well, talk about someone who's going to have a big week. I think Kenyon Drake is in a situation where this could be his absolute breakout game against the Lions. I would say my Lions, but I'm not sure that they're mine anymore. Ultimately, what I like in this matchup is a game script that favors handing it off to Drake, really seeing what he can do against a defense that's going to allow him to get some vision, meaning going back and forth. We can ask MJD about this, what kind of vision and what kind of opportunity you have running the ball against a Lions defense that looks confused at their linebacker, second level. Not going to be a good situation for the Detroit defense. A good situation for Kenyon Drake, though.
Marcus Grant, what wide receiver, speaking of vision, do you see having a solid matchup here this week?
Oh, I envision big things for scary Terry McLaurin. I mean, we talk about wanting pieces of concentrated passing games, and that's what you got in Washington. I mean, Terry McLaurin has a 27% target share, 34% share of the air yards. I mean, right now, this passing game is mostly McLaurin and Logan Thomas. They get the Browns this week. They've given up 43 points per game to wide receivers. Week 1, it was Marquise Brown with 101 yards. Week 2, it was Tyler Boyd with 72 and a touchdown. I think Terry McLaurin's going to have himself a pretty good week.
Oh, yeah. Terry McLaurin, you want these guys in concentrated roles where they get a lot of targets. And this speaks to DeAndre Hopkins, who I love. He has 36% of the target share in Arizona. That is the most in the NFL. And we were talking about time earlier. I'm old enough to remember when people thought it might be a problem that DeAndre Hopkins was going to Arizona, that he wasn't going to have a relationship with Kyler Murray that was going to lead to such, fruitful fantasy points. But here we are. He's crushing at 25 fantasy points per game this season. And he's got Cynthia's Lions because they're your Lions. If I have to wear the Bears for all these decades, you still got to claim the Lions. And they've allowed the 3rd most fantasy points to receivers this season.
Claiming the Bears and claiming the Lions, that's completely different animals in more ways than one. But I'm looking at Amari Cooper this week, who's kind of quietly had 16-plus fantasy points in both games so far this season. The matchup is great because, Seattle's allowing the most fantasy points per game to wide receivers this season, a ton, and then 4 top 12 fantasy wide receivers over 2 games. So this is an opportunity for Dak and Amari Cooper to keep the game close, keep that nice Russell Wilson throwing, Dak Prescott Prescott throwing. Who's going to catch the balls? Well, Amari Cooper is amongst the wide receivers that will benefit from this.
Yeah, starting to sense a trend on that Seahawks defense, or at least our collective lack of confidence in it. We'll have more on that later. Let's get to some news. For now, in case you missed it, we start with the Chargers rookie quarterback Justin Herbert will start his second straight game. Tyrod Taylor out with that rib injury that was a part of his hospitalization this past week. Herbert scored 24 points in the debut against KC. Rank, is that going to continue?
I don't think we're in a place in our lives where we're going to be starting Justin Herbert. But what we should really be encouraged by is things like that. Getting the ball to Joshua Kelly and his running backs out of the backfield. Taking some shots down the field to Keenan Allen and Mike Williams. And this is really what we want. I think when they had Tyrod in there, they were going to be a little bit more conservative. This allows them to open up the offense like it was last season with Phillip Rivers. And it really helps out the guys we drafted around the quarterback.
Elsewhere, Giants wideout Sterling Shepard goes to IR with turf toe. He suffered that injury in Week 1's loss to the Bears. The Giants used the roster spot to sign Devontae Freeman. But what did fantasy managers do for wide receivers with this team, Marcus?
Yeah, I mean, the hits just keep on coming for the Giants. The next guy up, you figure, it's probably going to be Golden Tate. I mean, there's not a whole lot of appealing options there when it comes to wide receivers with the Giants. We know Darius Slayton is probably going to get a lot of those looks. You hope Evan Ingram can kind of get himself going again in this offense. But at the wide receiver spot, you got the veteran Golden Tate, who may not be super appealing. There may be better options elsewhere on the waiver wire. But for Daniel Jones, this is a guy who's going to get suddenly a whole lot of attention.
Yeah, Week 2 for that injury to Shepard there. Kenny Golladay returning to practice for the Lions today off of that hamstring injury that's kept him out of the game for the first couple of weeks. The team expecting him to play in Week 3 against Arizona. Cynthia, how are you feeling about Golladay coming back from this injury?
Seems like everything I talk about here has to do with my Motor City Kitties. But this is one where it's a low floor and a very high ceiling. The game script dictates the ceiling, and Matthew Stafford is still an underrated and good quarterback. So Kenny Galladay's opportunity should be good. However, he hasn't played. The chemistry isn't there from the lack of preseason, the lack of reps that we've seen. So you are taking a risk. It is high upside, high downside in this matchup.
Elsewhere, Eagles rookie Jalen Reagor likely to miss a few weeks due to a ligament tear in his thumb. According to Mike Garafolo, the first-round draft pick has 5 catches in his first 2 games for Philadelphia. Time to bring in a man of confidence. It's our Maurice Jones-Drew. MJD, you were confident last week that Tom Brady would have 4 touchdowns. And then touchdown Tom let you down. So who and what does your mind lead you to be confident about to guarantee this week?
Well, I'm a man that understands that sometimes you're wrong. So then you lean on others. So I'm going to lean on Cynthia and Adam Rank, and I'm going to guarantee that Kyler Murray, gives you 30 points this week against the Detroit Lions. Kyler Murray has been lights out. It doesn't matter what defense he's going against. They're designing plays for him to run in the red zone. We've talked about the Lions giving up over 20 fantasy points to Mitchell Trubisky. Obviously, the same thing to Aaron Rodgers. And now Kyler Murray comes with this air raid attack, a banged-up secondary. We heard Cynthia talk about that as well. So if the math is right, that means I got to go with it. So Kyler Murray, 30-plus fantasy points this week. If you got him, you got him. I'm a believer.
Yeah, and it works out because Cynthia and Rank can also bear the brunt of the potential fallback if it doesn't work out. DK Metcalf's star continues to rise. Rank, tell us why he is a start this week.
Well, you heard Chris Collinsworth say it. He's an emerging star, and he's really a main eventer now. I believe this is going to be the last time that I feel compelled to put him on start and sit, because it's like when Randy Orton broke away from Evolution. It's like, okay, yeah, you're in the main event now. You'll headline WrestleMania and things like that. And DK has scored at least 19 fantasy points per game this season. He's had a receiving touchdown in both of those contests. So Patrick, just look at the numbers. And the Cowboys have allowed the 7th most fantasy points to receivers this season. And speaking of the Cowboys, I really love CeeDee Lamb here too. And I guess if I wanted to keep that wrestling analogy going, his trio in Dallas is like the New Day. And I guess he would be the Kofi Kingston, the guy who's going to break out and be a huge star. He's currently the wide receiver 26, but moving up. He's averaged 7.5 targets per game, but those targets, receptions, and yards have improved in each contest. And the Seahawks have allowed the most fantasy points to receivers this season. I can't promise a duplicate of what happened on Sunday night, but I think it's going to be close between these two teams.
All right, let's look over to who is sitting this week from you, Rank, at wide receiver.
Well, I'm going to look at Hollywood Brown, a star that we've wanted to see break out for quite some time. It's like Brandon Roth, like one moment you're Superman, the next one you're doing cameos in a Kevin Smith movie. And that's, listen, I'm not trying to besmirch him or anything, but he's currently the wide receiver 33, and his numbers fell off in week 2. And now he's going up against the Chiefs, who are really good against opposing receivers. They've allowed the fewest points to the position since 2019. And then let's talk about Cooper Kupp. I guess he was once a Hollywood star, but now you never see him. It's like when you see Josh Radnor on your timeline or something. You're like, oh my gosh, I remember when you were a thing, but now not so much, because he's currently the wide receiver 43, and that's after having a pretty decent game in week 2. He's had 6 targets or fewer in both games this season, 13 points or less. And this really goes back to that game he had against Cincinnati last year, where he had 220 receiving yards. We haven't heard from him since. They went on a bye, and then it's been a whole lot of nothing, it seems.
We have been hearing from Brandon Routh, though, Rank. The man has range. We will not slander Brandon Routh on this particular program. Let's look over at some running backs and some guys that you are starting this week.
Well, I'm going to start with Kenyon Drake, who we talked about earlier in the show. Has got a fantastic matchup against the Detroit Lions. They, of course, have allowed a lot of fantasy production to the position this season. In fact, the 4th most points. They've allowed 24 rushing touchdowns to running backs since the beginning of 2019. That's the 2nd highest total. And Kenyon Drake's on Twitter going against all the haters and defending. He defends fantasy. He feels like he's a part of us. Like when my friend who is like, when you're the popular kid who liked, what you liked, and you kind of get into that. And I also love David Montgomery this week, 22 fantasy points against the Giants. He had a really nice game against them, and this offensive line has improved. They made a coaching change during the offseason. We're starting to really see the benefits. And watch this play right here. Makes the guy miss, and then I thought this was going to be the touchdown. But he did turn one into a touchdown, and that's the one thing about the Giants, about the Falcons. They've allowed the 5th most receptions to running backs this season.
All right, who are the not popular kids at running back?
Well, I think Mark Ingram's still very popular, but you got to start looking towards the future. And he's had 11 touches or less in both games this season. He was outsnapped, or he did outsnap, I should say, J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards, but he was outcarried by Gus Edwards and Lamar. And you look at the game against Houston, he had that great run at the end that kind of helped push his fantasy point forward, and it looked pretty good. But I think ultimately, at some point, this is going to be JK's backfield. And he's sticking in that game against Houston. David Johnson is somebody that we're going to have to be very concerned about. I mean, he's had his moments of brilliance, like in The Notebook, when the lady, she snaps into consciousness and she's good for a couple of years. Like, oh my gosh. And James Garner wants to talk to her for those 5 good minutes. And that's, I feel, the way that we have to approach David Johnson, where there's going to be some games where he's fantastic. He was great the first week of the season. Wasn't so great last week against the Baltimore Ravens. This week, he's got the Pittsburgh Steelers, who have allowed the 2nd fewest rushing yards per game this year and the 4th fewest fantasy points to the position. So we're going to have to leave him on the bench.
And considering the way the film ended, Rank, I'd have to say our outlook for David Johnson is a little bit better there. We've got more starts and sits coming up for the quarterbacks and tight ends here on the show. But for now, we'll stick with the running back theme. And we'll check out the FedEx ground rankings and bring in Cynthia Freeland. Cynthia, tell us how you're going to rank the top 10 running backs this season.
Well, I'm not going to use The Notebook because the Notebook was really sad, and it was a great movie, but just not as happy as fantasy football. So when I ranked my top 10 this week, there are a few surprises, not really any at the top, kind of the usual suspects. It just really depends on matchup for those guys. But I want to point out Jonathan Taylor, who comes in at number 7. He faces the Jets. Now, last season, the Jets were known for their strong run defense. Hasn't been the case this season. They're allowing the 7th most fantasy points per game to running backs this season. This is also a game script that is very favorable for Jonathan Taylor, meaning I anticipate the Colts to be playing with the lead, meaning Jonathan Taylor should get a lot of second half carries. And then next up, Aaron Jones, who just lit up your fantasy lineup last week. I mean, those Packers were just on fire with him. This one is not a great matchup with him against New Orleans, who's allowing the second fewest rushing yards per game to running backs since the beginning of 2019. It's not that he's going to be bad. It's just he's probably not going to go something crazy like 31.6 or 45.6. Got to get those Lions in there again. You know, obviously got to hate on the Lions a little bit more. But this matchup against the Saints, they're going to need Aaron Jones, so that's why he's still in the top 10. But it is not a great matchup against Demario Davis.
Detroit Lions get it together, at least so Cynthia can find some peace. We are here for Thursday and a showdown in the Sunshine State. We're here for Fitzmagic and Minshew Mania for a new day in the 305 and high hopes in Duval County. Dolphins, Jags, Thursday Night Football, Thursday at 8 on NFL Network. Marcus Grant, do we know anybody familiar with the Jacksonville Jaguars?
I think we do, actually. We're going to step in and take a break from browsing Brandon Routh's IMDb page for Mo Money, Mo Problems with former Jaguars running back Maurice Jones-Drew. And we will evaluate some of the guys in this Dolphins-Jaguars game who may be on the upswing. And we're going to start with a guy, MJD, who played your old position there, the running back for the Jacksonville Jaguars, James Robinson. Is he Mo Money or Mo Problems this week?
Well, Marcus, this guy is Mo Money,
Mo Money.
And I'm going to tell you why. He's getting opportunities. 18 touches the last 2 games, 15.5 fantasy points. This is the thing about him. They're putting him in position to be successful. He's catching the ball out of the backfield. When they do run the ball, they're running downhill like he did in college, A-gap to A-gap runs, which he excels like we're seeing here. This is what you want. When you see what a guy has done in the past and what he did great in college, you want to try to emulate that as much as possible. Jay Gruden and the Jaguars are doing that. If you have him, you need to play him for Thursday night.
Yeah, really no running back competition. The only other guy getting really backfield snaps is Laviska Shenault. Mike Gesicki was a tight end favorite among fantasy analysts in the preseason. Week 1, not so great. Week 2, a whole lot better. Is he Mo Money or Mo Problem?
I think this week he's definitely going to be Mo Money. Again, after a big game against the Buffalo Bills, this Jaguars defense gives it up to the tight end. I mean, again, Jonnu Smith had 4 catches for 84 yards, 2 touchdowns last week, with A.J. Brown being out. So that lets me know, okay, you have Devontae Parker, Preston Williams. Obviously, your tight end here, Mike Gesicki, is going to have a big day. I expect him to go out there and have a big-time performance on Thursday night.
All right, and then one last one, Devontae Parker. We finally got the breakout season we were waiting for from him last year, and off to an okay start this year. Is he Mo Money or Mo Problems this week?
This is a problem for me, and it's not because of him. It's because of the person that he's going to be hanging out with, and that's C.J. Henderson of the Jaguars. That cornerback, that rookie corner has done a great job. He's been masterful throughout the last couple games. Expect him to shadow Devontae Parker, and if he does, I'm just a little nervous about him, what he's done. He did a great job against T.Y. Hilton, and I think he'll do another good job. So I'm going to kind of stay away from him. At most, he'll be a flex play for me.
Yeah, I think with Preston Williams there, Devontae Parker's production has sort of been cut in half. There's just a lot of targets to get the ball to.
What's the range of outcomes as we start to look at Calvin Ridley, the overall wide receiver 1 through the first 2 weeks?
Well, the matchup is not so great because the Bears have yet to allow a touchdown to a wide receiver. But if you look at that upstairs, that reflects 6 receptions, 77 yards, and that first touchdown to a wideout allowed by the Bears. The ceiling is huge and does include 2 touchdowns, just like we've seen in both of the past 2 games. But the floor doesn't include the touchdown because, of course, Julio Jones is still there, just like Marcus Grant told us. So for me, this Calvin Ridley projection is still awesome. It's just not 2 touchdowns and absolutely bananas.
Yeah, that floor projection for those just joining us, right, is the baseline of what Cynthia seeds. The upstairs, right, is the higher idea. And the ceiling, which for Calvin Ridley was 28.8, which for me, coincidentally, was the modem speed that I used to draft my first fantasy team back in 1997. Let's look over, Cynthia, at Robbie Anderson, the current wide receiver 5. What are projections for him?
Okay, so when you look at Robbie Anderson, you have to take into account the fact that the Chargers are very good in their secondary. You have to take into account the situation. Okay, what is going on now with that offense in a Christian McCaffrey-less world? I think that's the way that you say that word. But I love the opportunity here to take advantage of the fact that they could look at the Tyreek Hill film and try to kind of run those routes for Robbie Anderson and get him those points. So if you look to see the upstairs, and I would base my projections on the upstairs and then look for guys with super high ceilings, which is exactly what Robbie Anderson has. So that upstairs is a really good opportunity. That one reflects 4 receptions and 61 yards.
All right, Cynthia, let's look over at John Brown, the current wide receiver 10. Is that going to stick?
Okay, so when you look at John Brown, you again is always considering the opportunity here. This is not the one where you get the kind of, it's closer to the floor, that upstairs, that median projection. Why? Well, the defense that they're facing in the Rams is pretty gnarly. So the upstairs is 3 receptions, 43 yards, and only in the ceiling case you have that touchdown with 5 receptions and 62 yards. That's like a busted coverage that could potentially happen. But I think he's going to see a lot of, Jalen Ramsey, who is not a good matchup for any wide receiver.
So that is a look at these wide receivers. Cynthia, may everybody's ceilings be their floor, not the roof. May your ceiling be your floor as we leave Cynthia and get a look at some waiver wire action. These are the top 10 most added guys that everyone wants a chunk of. That Niners rushing attack there at the top. Jerick McKinnon there. Those who haven't already picked up Russell Gage or James Robinson did so earlier this week. A lot of Jags on this list here. If you missed out on these 10 targets, hope is not lost. You just have to dig through the back of the fridge a little bit, get some waiver wire leftovers. MJD, who else is worth picking up out of the fridge this week?
Well, Patrick, we saw Devontae Freeman being a guy that a lot of people picked up. Well, I say this, go get Dion Lewis because he knows the system. He's been there all throughout training camp. He was brought in to be that third down back to help out a little bit with Saquon Barkley. Now with Saquon being out, do not be surprised if Dion Lewis shows up and makes a ton of plays for you. And plus, as we can see, there's a lot of passes out of the backfield for him for those PPR leagues.
Well, I mean, you're looking around the fridge, and you got some orange juice, you got some purple stuff. And, oh, hey, look, there's Jeff Wilson right there. I know everybody was very big on getting Jerick McKinnon this week in San Francisco, but McKinnon's not going to get all of the work there by himself. Wilson is likely going to slide in there and get some of those touches. He was a touchdown machine early last season, 4 scores in his first 2 games. And that Giants run defense, or at least against fantasy running backs, looks a little bit deceiving. They're lower because they haven't given up a touchdown yet, but they are giving up yardage in chunks. And I think Wilson could break a big play or two. Maybe that's all you need if you're playing him in deeper leagues.
Yeah, there was a player who I really liked in the NFL draft this season, KJ Hamler. I thought that coming into the league that he was going to be somebody who could make an immediate impact. And of course, he's going to be available in everybody's fantasy league right now, especially with the situation that's going on in Denver. And I understand that Drew Lock is going to miss some time. I don't believe that he's going to go on IR. But Hamler is somebody with a lot of ability who I'm just going to take a speculative add-on right now with Cortland Sutton out. I think that there's going to be some room there. I think that Noah Fant probably moves to the top of the food chain there. But even with Jerry Jeudy there and everything that's going on, I think KJ Hamler is somebody I really want to focus on.
I'll take another rookie receiver. I know Kenny G is back to make music for Matt Stafford, but I still think Quintez Cephas is worth an add. The 10 targets in week 1 probably aren't coming back, but he caught everything he was thrown in week 2. And just like Julio and company make things work for Russell Gage, I think we can see Cephas blossom as the season goes on. Visit NFL.com to get a look at these waiver wire targets. Not just these, there's plenty of talented guys on rosters all over the league that you can reach in there, rummage around, get the purple stuff, the OJ, and yes, of course, the Sunny D. It's time for the quarterbacks. Who are you starting this week?
Well, looking past the obvious guys, let's start with Ryan Tannehill. And last year, played a little bit like Clark Kent for the first couple years of his career. Now he's Superman. And I know Brandon Roth has had a nice career. I know he's Ray Palmer, the Atom, but he was once Superman, and now he's the Atom. But anyways, let's talk about Tannehill. At least 2 touchdown passes in each game this season. I know coming into this year, a lot of people thought like maybe they would lean on Derrick Henry a little bit more, and I think people and managers who drafted Derrick Henry kind of wish that they would, but they're throwing the ball at a pretty impressive clip. And Tannehill has proven that last year was not a fluke. So now, especially with a great matchup against the Minnesota Vikings, you got to start him this week. And I'm also starting Josh Allen. And again, this goes back to something I was talking about earlier about guys who are no longer going to be in this piece because they're too obvious now. And it's going to be Josh Allen. He's the QB2 this season. We love his running, but he's thrown for more yards than any other quarterback this season. And of course, that is one of the things that people had that, like me, were concerned about. Is he going to be able to match the running? He's certainly doing it this year. He's the heart and soul of that team. I know they're ECW fans in Buffalo. He's the Tommy Dreamer of your squad. So he's an automatic start from here on out.
Well, Rank, nobody's going to accuse you of being obvious on one of your quarterback six.
Well, you know what? I just want to put this out there. Matt Ryan has a tough matchup, and I know that he's the QB6, and he's been playing very well, and everything's been clicking for them. But the Bears have been playing really good defense this season. They've allowed only one passing touchdown this year. They've allowed the third fewest points to quarterbacks, and I understand they played Daniel Jones last week, but they were in a position where Daniel Jones had to throw the entire second half. They played Matthew Stafford in week 1. So they are going out there and they are matching it. And looking at Gardner Minshew, I would rather start Gardner over Matt Ryan this week. And you know what? You can at me or do whatever you want, but I'm going to stand to it. And another quarterback you need to bench. I don't know. I guess I had to pick an easy one. Listen, Patrick, you gave me a lot of credit, but Kirk Cousins, we all know not to start him. I know everybody's out there hey, thanks, Rank. Thanks for telling me not to start the guy I had no intention of ever starting. I mean, the Vikings are the Vikings in name only. Donald Logue is more of a Viking than these guys. So I think it goes without saying you can leave Kirk Cousins and a lot of these Vikings on the bench.
If not a message for fantasy managers, maybe it's a message for Mike Zimmer to consider Sean Mannion. Let's look over at some tight ends, right?
Well, I love Tyler Higbee, and at the end of last season, he really asserted himself into this Rams offense to the deficit of Cooper Kupp. And in week 1, we didn't see a lot of it, and people started to grow a little bit concerned. But in week 2, those fears were erased. And I think what we're seeing from the Rams is something that we kind of had an inkling to coming into this season, was that with the unfamiliarness at the running back position, I don't know how to do. They don't have Todd Gurley anymore. So when they get near the 5, I think they're looking to throw the ball a little bit more. And Tyler Higbee is going to be the benefactor. Obviously, he is going to be a guy that when they get near the 5-yard line, he is going to be kind of their de facto red zone option. Him, Bobby Trees carried the ball last week inside the 5. So I think that that's going to be huge for him. And I also like Jimmy Graham this week. I know a lot of people made fun of the Bears for signing 55 tight ends this offseason, and Jimmy Graham was washed, but he's looked pretty good in the first 2 weeks. If not for a couple of mistimed jumps in week 1 against the Detroit Lions, he would have had multiple touchdowns in that game. It's really fun to see him kind of breaking out a little bit. And the Falcons have allowed the 4th most fantasy points to the position this season. So I think this is a huge opportunity for him to go out there and once again make a name for himself at the tight end spot.
Who does not have an opportunity this week at the tight end position, right?
Evan Ingram is somebody who concerns me a little bit. Now, he is the one player that I'm looking to from this Giants offense to step up in the wake of the absence of Saquon Barkley. And we saw it on Sunday. Evan Ingram is an athletic player who can make great football plays, and he is going to be a factor for the Giants this season. I think having Jason Garrett there as the offensive coordinator is going to help. The only problem is they play the San Francisco 49ers this week, who are very tough against tight ends. So this is probably not the week to start him, but I think moving forward, he is going to end up having a nice breakout season.
Yeah, it's not the right time, as people might say, if they're trying to get out of a relationship. Thanks, Adam Rank there. We'll look at the quarterback scoring leaders who seem to be upside down this season. But is week 3 going to see a return to normalcy? Let's get the FedEx Air rankings with Cynthia Freeland. Cynthia, how do you stack the quarterbacks this weekend?
I think it's more of a return to what we thought ahead of the season. I'm thinking about that first question you asked me today about time and place and where we all really are. And we're in a time and a place with this one where maybe the Kyler Murray stands out. But I think when you look at Patrick Mahomes facing Baltimore, this is kind of a Patrick Mahomes output that you would have expected kind of going into week one, although a very difficult defense that he's facing, allowing the fifth fewest fantasy points per game to quarterbacks this season. However, this game, I believe, is going to be different. Patrick Mahomes' ability to target a young, different linebacking and safety core is going to be a nice difference maker in this one. Quick passes, little dump off to Clyde Edwards-Helaire, and that opportunity to just overcome the blitz is going to be a huge way that you're going to insulate your fantasy points, because that's where Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs will have an advantage over this defense. And then if you look Cam Newton, which that one we wouldn't have thought of maybe necessarily ahead of the season unless we were somehow able to divine Bill Belichick's brain, which would have been nice knowing going forward, but whatever. Cam Newton's ability versus the Raiders, that one is all muscle, brawn, and that rushing ability. They are weak during their linebacking core second level. They're not getting pressure efficiently. And by the way, the way to overcome pressure is to have Cam Newton just run the ball. This is going to be an interesting one. He's going to be able to target the third level, the second level, and then just rush for those first downs himself.